Before we begin, take a moment. What time is it where you are? Midnight? Dawn? Somewhere in between? Let us know in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from tonight. Whether you're in a city that never sleeps or on a quiet countryside porch, you're welcome here. If this story brings you even a little peace, a little stillness, please consider liking and subscribing. We tell stories like this every week, just for nights like these. Now let's drift back to a man who forgot the sound of his own voice. For 18 years, the man on the hill had spoken to no one, not to strangers, not to neighbors, not even to himself. The wind might have whispered his name once, long ago, but even it had long since moved on to other valleys. His house was small, square, silent. The windows were shuttered not out of fear, but because no one ever looked in, and he had nothing left to see out. The days passed slowly, drawn out like the lines in his weather-worn face. He built his fire at dawn, not for warmth, but for rhythm. He fed the chickens out of habit, not hunger. He kept one rocking chair outside, but never sat in it. The seat belonged to a ghost, and the man knew better than to disturb what sat there. The townsfolk, those who remembered him, called him the Quiet One. Some said he'd once been a rider, a gunslinger, a husband. Some said he'd simply stopped trying. The truth didn't matter anymore, not to them, and not to him. Until that day. It was a Tuesday, but he hadn't counted days in years. The morning was dry. The light hadn't yet climbed over the ridge when he heard it. A knock. Not a loud one. Not even firm. It was soft, rhythmic, like rain tapping wood in a pattern only children know. The man stood still inside his doorway, not breathing. Another knock came. Then another. 7 knocks, spaced unevenly, with hesitation between them. He didn't open the door. Not yet. He waited, as if silence would explain it all. But it didn't. The knocks returned, and this time, he noticed something no voices followed. No grown-up. Shuffle, no demand, no threat. Just the soft presence of being. He opened the door slowly, like the hinges might scream if rushed. And there they were, 7 children. Different heights, different postures, but all of them worn thin by wind and time. Dust clung to their sleeves, their cheeks, even their eyelashes. Not one of them spoke. The oldest, maybe 12, held the smallest by the hand. The littlest one stared straight up at him, eyes wide, empty but hopeful. The man blinked, then stepped back, not to invite, not to reject, but because something in his chest had cracked. A rib? A memory? He wasn't sure. The children stepped forward, not all at once, but like water spilling from a bowl too full to hold still. The man didn't speak. Not yet. He didn't remember how. The children sat near the fire pit, though no fire had been lit. The smallest one pulled their knees to their chest. One of them touched the worn handle of the rocking chair, then let go. That evening, the man brought out a blanket, one that had never been unfolded in 18 years. He set it down on the porch boards without a word. The children wrapped themselves in it without asking. That night, he stayed awake by the window. The rocking chair creaked once. Just once. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the silence no longer felt like his own. The next morning brought no sunrise, only a soft gray light that settled over the hills like dust on forgotten shelves. And when the man stepped outside his door, the first thing he saw weren't the children's eyes or their still shoulders, but the shoes lined up neatly along the edge of the porch, 7 pairs, none of them matching, none of them fit for travel, and all of them so small they made his own boots feel like monuments. They looked like shoes that had walked through too much and too far. Soles worn thin, laces frayed or missing altogether, one pair tied with twine, another patched with cloth, as if each one carried a story no one had dared to write down. The children were already awake, sitting just beyond the doorway on the wooden planks. Knees tucked, hands still, eyes cast down or off into the distance, and still, not a word was spoken, Not from them, not from him, not even from the birds, as if the world itself was leaning in to listen to something quieter than sound. The wind stirred, brushing past the dry grass, but it didn't cross the threshold of the house that day, as if it too knew better than to break what was forming there, a silence so full it no longer felt empty, but rather like a breath being held between strangers who didn't yet know how to trust the air. The man watched them, the way they breathed as one, the way the older ones kept glancing at the younger ones, guarding them without moving, like little sentries made of bone and dust and something far older than childhood. One of the girls had wrapped herself in the blanket he'd left, her fingers gripping the edge like it was the last solid thing in the world. The man didn't ask where they came from, didn't ask why their shoes were so small or how long they'd been walking, because he knew not in facts or maps, in the way the body remembers its own ghosts. He'd worn boots like that once, smaller than he could admit now, and he remembered what it was like to walk far enough that your name got smaller in the distance behind you. The children didn't fidget, didn't demand, didn't cry, and somehow that made them harder to ignore. They were a kind of quiet he understood, a kind of loss that matched his own. He thought of the porch as it had been yesterday morning, bare, quiet, swept clean by wind and habit. And now, with those little shoes lined up, it looked like the front row of a forgotten church, waiting for something sacred to begin. He didn't sit down. Not yet. The rocking chair remained untouched, sacred in its own silence, but he did bring out a chipped metal cup, filled it with water, and placed it near the shoes. No one moved toward it, not immediately, but eventually, the oldest child reached out, took a sip, and passed it along, like a ritual that didn't need explaining. The man watched all of this with hands in his pockets and a weight in his chest that was older than yesterday. He didn't speak, still unsure if his voice would even sound right in the air again. But when he stepped back inside and closed the door, he left it just slightly ajar, not wide, not welcoming, just enough to say, without saying, "I see you, and I am still listening." It wasn't until the third evening that the man brought out the old tin matchbox from the drawer by the stove. He hadn't touched it in months, maybe years, not because he couldn't make fire, but because there had never been a reason to light one for anyone but himself, and even that had stopped mattering long ago. The children were seated again in their quiet circle near the edge of the clearing, still and waiting without asking, their shoes tucked beneath them, their backs to the dying light that stretched long shadows across the ground like strings pulled taut by memory. He didn't say anything as he approached, no invitation, no command, just a slow walk with something in his hand that felt heavier than it should have. When he stopped by the ring of blackened stones that once knew warmth, he crouched down, knees creaking, and placed the matchbox on the ground between them, like an offering too personal to pass hand to hand. He didn't light it himself, only looked at the youngest boy, no older than 8, whose face was marked with quiet dirt and defiant stillness. And then he nodded barely, almost imperceptibly, before looking away again, not out of shame but because eye contact had become a forgotten language he no longer trusted himself to speak. The boy reached forward with slow fingers, picked up the box, turned it in his palm, and then reached to gather the smallest twigs and bits of straw from beneath the nearby scrub. His hands didn't shake, but the man's did, just slightly, as he stood again and crossed his arms as if to hold himself together. One by one, the children added to the little pile in the center of the stones, carefully, thoughtfully, like they were building more than just a fire, like they were laying down memory piece by piece, twig by twig, in hopes that it might glow. When the boy finally struck the match, it sputtered once, then caught, and the small flame danced in the gathering dark like something reborn, flickering against small faces, lighting up eyes that hadn't seen warmth in too long. The man stood just behind them, watching without watching, his shadow stretching long behind the fire, as if his presence was more comfortable as a silhouette than a body. No one spoke, not the children, not the man, not even the fire, which crackled with gentle discretion, as though it understood the rules of this gathering. No questions, no stories, only warmth. And somehow, in the orange light, everything looked natural, like they'd always been here, like the stones had been waiting all this time, like the twigs were only meant to burn in this very moment. The man turned and walked back toward the house before the fire grew too large, leaving behind only the scent of smoke and something that smelled almost like belonging. He didn't look back, but he paused at the door, resting his hand on the worn wood, and for the first time in 18 years, he listened not for silence, but for breathing 7 small rhythms, steady and close, beside the fire that burned not out of necessity, but out of hope. There was a shelf in the back room of the cabin, one that hadn't been touched in nearly 2 decades, layered with dust like parchment over forgotten scripture. And on that shelf were 3 folded blankets, wool, worn, and smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. The man didn't remember placing them there, not exactly, but when he opened the door and saw them, lined like folded memories on a wooden altar, something in his chest shifted, not painfully, just enough to remind him that he'd once prepared for warmth, even when there had been no one left to give it to. He took 1, then 2, then all 3, and carried them with both hands as if they were heavier than firewood, not because of weight, but because of meaning, the kind of weight only memory can stitch into cloth. Outside, the children were seated, as they always were now, quietly, as if their very bones knew not to make demands. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, just knelt beside the oldest and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders with a motion so slow it was almost reverent. She flinched at first, only slightly, but didn't pull away, and the others watched in silence as he moved down the line, draping cloth across backs and shoulders that had long forgotten what care felt like. The youngest boy, the one who had built the fire, pulled the blanket close to his face and inhaled, as if trying to memorize a smell he'd never known before. The man didn't wait to be thanked. He wouldn't have known what to do with the words if they came, and instead turned and went back inside, but paused again at the doorframe, fingers brushing against the wood like a man trying to feel of something is real. In the quiet that followed, the children pulled their knees in beneath the blankets, shoulders huddled but not afraid, and something like peace settled over the porch, not loud, not full, but soft and simple and enough. Inside, the man sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the place on the wall where the fire's light used to flicker long ago. And in his mind, he tried to remember why he had kept those blankets at all, who they were meant for, what occasion. He had imagined, but nothing came, no faces, no names, only the feeling that, somehow, they had waited for exactly this moment. Outside, the wind moved gently around the corners of the cabin, circling the porch like a shepherd watching over its flock, and the fire from the night before glowed low, but steady, like a heartbeat that had found its rhythm again. He didn't sleep that night, but he didn't stay by the window either. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened to the silence outside, which was no longer empty, but full of breath, full of warmth, full of 7 blankets being held tightly against the night by hands too small and hearts too heavy to speak. The morning was quieter than usual, not because there was less sound, but because there was more meaning in the silence, a stillness that seemed to hold its breath, as the children moved carefully around the porch and into the doorway, not stepping inside, but leaning just enough to see what made the house more than just walls and wood. The man wasn't watching them exactly, but he noticed the way the smallest one dragged his fingers across the doorframe, how the girl with the torn sleeve looked at the rocking chair like it might hold answers. And then, without announcement, one of them, the boy who had barely spoken with his eyes, ducked slightly beneath the table by the window and pulled out a rusted tin box, its lid squeaking open like it hadn't been moved since dust first settled on the floorboards. The man froze mid-step, not because he had forgotten the box, but because he had tried so hard to forget what was inside. The boy sat cross-legged and opened the lid with the kind of care only children and mourners know, revealing a thin bundle of old letters, a dried sprig of wild lavender, and a single photograph folded twice, worn at the edges like a memory handled. Too many times. He held it up, slowly, like an artifact, and in the dull light of the morning, the image flickered into clarity. A woman standing in front of a small clapboard house, arms wrapped around 7 children, all of them smiling in the brittle, hopeful way only people with very little can manage. The man didn't step forward, didn't grab it from the boy's hands, but he turned his face away sharply, as if struck by something soundless. His hands, though, betrayed him. They trembled, open at his sides, not clenched, not reaching, just shaking like leaves that don't know if the wind is a threat or a lullaby. The children didn't ask, didn't press, but they looked from the photo to him and back again, as if trying to match the lines in the image to the weight in his shoulders. He swallowed once, then again, but still said nothing. The words stayed behind the dam in his throat, heavy with the pressure of years unspoken. The photograph remained in the boy's hands for a long moment before he placed it gently back into the box, folding it exactly as it had been, and slid the tin back under the table as if nothing had happened, as if returning it would somehow return the time that had been lost. The man walked to the edge of the porch and stood there, staring out across the land that had not changed in 18 years, but that somehow felt smaller now, less like a fortress and more like a stage on which everything had already been written. Behind him, the children resumed their quiet places, and the fire from the night before was rekindled not with matches, but with the leftover heat from hearts sitting just close enough to believe in the warmth of something older than stories. The man didn't go back inside right away. He stayed at the edge of the boards, breathing slowly, eyes closed not in peace, but in surrender, letting the image of the woman and 7 children flicker through his memory like candlelight under wind. When he finally moved, it was only to bring out another chair, one that had remained folded in the corner for as long as the photograph had been hidden, and he placed it beside the rocking one, not for himself, and not for ghosts, but for someone who might someday want to ask a question. That night, long after the fire had gone to embers and the wind had curled itself gently beneath the porch boards, the house stood quieter than usual, not in emptiness, but in a kind of anticipation, like the air itself knew something long buried was about to stir. The children had wrapped themselves in the now familiar wool blankets, their breathing slow and steady in the rhythm of sleep or something close to it, while the man sat just inside the doorway, barely lit by the flicker of the final flame, his hands resting on his knees as if waiting for permission to move. He hadn't spoken all day, not that they had expected him to, but the photograph from earlier clung to the edges of his thoughts like smoke that doesn't fade, curling in corners, haunting in stillness, and in that hush, one voice finally rose, barely above a whisper, from one of the children whose face he hadn't learned to read yet. "Abigail," the boy said, no louder than wind brushing grass. A single name offered to the dark like a secret too heavy to keep, and the syllables fell into the space between them with the weight of something sacred. The man didn't move, not at first, but his shoulders pulled tighter, and his eyes, dry for so many years, found water again, not in rivers, but in the slow shimmer of something cracking beneath the surface. He didn't ask how the boy knew the name, didn't speak to confirm it, didn't gasp or flinch or rise from the chair. He only closed his eyes and let the name ring out in the silence like a bell he'd been afraid to hear. Abigail, a name he had tucked so far into the folds of his soul that even in dreams it only came in fragments. The curve of a laugh, the weight of a touch, the sound of a footstep that never arrived again. It wasn't the name itself that broke him, but the fact that it had come from a child, a stranger, spoken without demand or context, as though the universe had finally decided he had held it inside too long. He wanted to answer, wanted to say the name back, wanted to unwrap it from the chains he'd kept wrapped tight around his throat, but the words stayed frozen. Not out of pride, but out of fear that speaking them would undo what little was holding him together. The boy who had whispered it said nothing else, didn't even look at him, as if the act of naming had been enough. A torch passed without needing hands to meet. The man leaned forward slightly, elbows to knees, and stared at the dying light. And somewhere inside him, the names he had kept locked away for 18 years, names of those lost, those left, those loved and never found again, began to line up. Behind Abigail, not shouting, not crying, just waiting, patient and soft, like children at the edge of a story not yet told. And in that moment, though his lips did not move, the silence around him felt different, warmer, fuller, as though the name had opened a door not to sound, but to memory, and the man, for the first time in years, did not feel entirely alone inside it. The storm arrived without warning, though the sky had been heavy all afternoon, pressing down with the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. And when night finally fell, it did so with a suddenness that was almost theatrical lightning, splitting the distant hills, thunder rolling not just across the land but through it, as if it were shaking the very bones of the earth itself. The cabin creaked in the wind's grasp, not violently, but like an old man remembering too much, and inside, the children huddled closer to one another, their small hands gripping fabric and hope in equal measure. It wasn't fear that filled the room, not exactly. It was something quieter, older, the kind of dread that doesn't scream, but waits at the edge of sleep, whispering old memories into the cracks of the walls. The man sat by the hearth, unmoving, his boots set just outside the glow of the firelight, eyes not on the flames but on the shadows they threw against the far wall, tall and stretching, like questions without answers. The storm did not ask for attention, it took it. Each clap of thunder seemed to reach into the chest, rearranging the quiet they had worked so carefully to build, and still the man said nothing. Outside, the wind howled like something ancient and wounded, but inside the cabin, the fire held its ground, low and steady, casting an amber calm that the storm couldn't quite drown. One of the younger children whimpered in the dark, not loud, not long, just enough for the man to hear it in the spaces between thunder, and without a word, he stood. His steps were slow, careful, as if the floor itself might be listening, and he moved from one child to the next, lifting the fallen edges of their blankets, tucking them back around narrow shoulders, smoothing fabric over trembling knees. He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort in words or gestures, grant only the weight of a hand here, the pull of a blanket there, a quiet presence moving like warmth itself through the cabin's silence. The children didn't thank him, not because they didn't want to, but because gratitude has a sound, and none of them were ready to risk it, not yet. They watched him, some with eyes half closed, others through the slits of barely parted lids, as he moved like a memory might slow, sure, half forgotten but undeniable. When he finished, he returned to the hearth, not to sit, but to stand just beside the edge of light, where his shadow could stretch out behind him like a shelter built of silence. The fire crackled, the wind screamed, and the cabin remained whole. In the darkest hour before dawn, when the storm finally began to tire and the rain softened into something like a lullaby, one of the children whispered a word no one else could hear, and though the man made no move to show he'd heard it, something in the set of his shoulders shifted, softened, like a burden that had found a place to rest. And when morning came, bright and clean and utterly still, the only trace of the night's violence was the way the blankets lay, perfectly folded over each sleeping child, like quiet proof that someone had stood between them and the storm and stayed until it passed. The morning sun came shyly through the thin curtains, painting long lines across the wooden floorboards, and while the older children still rested beneath their blankets, the smallest one sat cross-legged near the table with a stub of pencil in his hand and a folded piece of yellowed paper spread flat like a window to something unspoken. He didn't ask for permission, didn't seek attention, he just began to draw, slowly, deliberately, the way only a child does when the act itself matters more than the result. The pencil moved in soft arcs and jagged edges, each line growing more certain as the shapes took form. A small square house, a man with broad shoulders standing just in front of it, and 7 small figures in a row nearby, all drawn with stick limbs and open hands. The man noticed only when the boy stood, wordlessly approached, and extended the paper with both hands, not expectantly, not shyly, just offering it the way someone offers truth, without armor. The man took the drawing without a word, his fingers curling around the edges like he was holding something fragile, and for a long moment he didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move, just looked, not at the quality of the sketch, but at the shape of something he'd never dared to imagine. Himself, not alone. The boy said nothing, only returned to the porch and resumed his quiet seat, and the others followed suit, sensing somehow that something important had just passed between them all, even if no one named it. The man stood there for a while, then reached for the small drawer near the stove where he kept odd nails and a rusted hammer whose handle was splintered from disuse. As he placed the drawing flat against the wall above the fireplace, the act of lifting the hammer felt strangely ceremonial, like raising a flag or burying a letter. And when he drove the first nail into the wood, the sharp crack echoed through the house like a rifle, but no one flinched. The children didn't move, didn't cover their ears, didn't speak, they just listened as if the sound were part of a story they already knew by heart. The second strike was softer, slower, as if the hammer too remembered silence, and when the final nail went in, the man stepped back and looked at the drawing again, not with pride, but with a kind of reverence usually reserved for gravestones or family portraits. For the first time in years, something hung on his wall that wasn't a shadow. The cabin, long stripped of decoration, now held a symbol not of the past, but of the moment, drawn in pencil by a boy who hadn't spoken 10 words since arriving. The fire popped gently in the hearth, as if in quiet applause, and the morning light finally reached the drawing's edges, casting soft shadows around the 7 small figures and the man, who stood among them like someone who had been found instead of forgotten. The sun broke gently across the horizon that morning, not with drama or color, but with a quiet clarity that made the dust in the air glow like memory. And as the light slipped through the cracks in the wooden frame, the man stood just outside. The doorway not leaning, not resting, simply standing, as if his body had remembered something before his mind did. Behind him, the children still stirred in slow patterns of waking blankets rustling. Breath deepening, no laughter yet, no footsteps. Just the beginning of another silent morning that had over time grown to feel like rhythm. The man didn't glance back, didn't look to see if they were watching, but something in the way he squared his shoulders, in the way his hands hung still at his sides, made the air tighten around him like a held breath. And then, without warning and without ceremony, he spoke, not loud, not cracked or broken, but soft, steady, like a note struck on a long-forgotten instrument. "You're home," he whispered, 2 words so small they could have been mistaken for wind, and yet they rang louder than any thunder the prairie had ever heard. He didn't follow them with explanation, didn't turn to see their reaction, didn't need to, because those words weren't meant to be received. They were meant to be released. For 18 years his voice had been a locked room, a cellar sealed under grief and memory and silence, and now, in the cool golden light of morning, he had finally found the key, not in bravery, but in presence, in 7 quiet figures who asked nothing and stayed anyway. The words hung in the air, gently, like the last embers of a fire that no longer needs to burn to keep people close. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in prayer, but in stillness, and when he opened them again, something behind them had shifted, softened, as if the landscape he saw now had been painted differently by the words he'd just let go. Inside the cabin, one of the older children sat up and looked toward the door, not startled, just curious, and met the man's gaze for a brief second before nodding, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if to say, "Yes, we heard you. Yes, we believe. You." And that was all that passed between them that morning. No clapping, no tears, just the warmth of a space that had learned to hold breath, now beginning to exhale. He turned back inside after a while, walking slowly, each step lighter than the one before, and the boards beneath his boots didn't creak the same way they used to, less like weight, more like welcome. And in the center of the room, beneath the drawing still pinned above the hearth, 7 small bowls sat waiting on the table. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the man pulled down the tin of flour and began to measure. Not because anyone had asked him to, but because some words don't end when they're spoken, they begin. The silence didn't end when the words came. It changed, evolved, stretched itself out like a warm blanket across wooden floorboards and sleeping children, no longer heavy with absence but tender with presence. And in the days that followed, the cabin didn't grow louder, it simply became fuller. The man still rose early, still moved with care, still paused before every step as if the house might need permission. But now he paused not out of habit, but to listen to the breaths that filled the spaces between the walls, to the soft scuffs of 7 sets of feet, to the quiet laughter that sometimes slipped out like sunlight under a cloud. The children didn't ask for stories, and he didn't offer them, but there was a rhythm now, a shared routine, a morning light that belonged in one set of eyes, a fire that no longer needed tending by only 2 hands. He still didn't speak much, not because he couldn't, but because he had learned that silence, when shared, is not emptiness but intimacy. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch and just watch them playing with pebbles, tying string into knots, staring at the clouds like they were waiting for something they already had, and he would feel something stir in his chest. Not pain, not joy, just a steady warmth like the coals of an old fire refusing to die. In the evenings, after supper made quietly and eaten even quieter, they would gather near the hearth. No instructions given, no roles assigned, just 7 children and a man who had remembered how to breathe with others again. And the silence between them felt different than the one he had known for 18 years. This silence didn't isolate, it connected. It hummed softly, held space, offered room for memories to rise gently without choking him. He would sometimes close his eyes and count their breaths, not aloud, but inwardly, matching each inhale to a name he had never spoken, to a ghost he had once loved, to a promise buried beneath time and dust. The cabin held them like a shell holds the echo of something older. And outside the prairie rolled on, golden and wide, no longer indifferent but watchful. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched like tired limbs across the porch, one of the children sat beside him without a word and leaned their head on his shoulder, not for warmth, not for comfort, but for company, and he let it stay there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the horizon that no longer felt so far away. And in that moment, the silence was complete, not because nothing was said, but because nothing needed to be. It was not the silence of grief or fear or shame, but the silence of understanding, the kind that lives between people who don't need to explain themselves to be known. And so the house remained still, not empty, not echoing, just steady filled, with the quiet sound of 7 soft breaths, and the long memory of a man who no longer needed to hide from the world or from himself.